In part 2 of our series on how to play Reality's Edge, we are going to cover the mechanics of the game, or how your character's abilities work. Each miniature in the game has a stat line consisting of the attributes of the miniature. We have divided the abilities into 3 categories, reflecting what kind of miniature you have. On the far left are all the stats that miniatures that represent physical beings in the real world get. These are pretty self-explanatory, and if you play Infinity, Kill Team, or Necromunda, you should see the parallels. The exception to that might be the firewall. Remember that this game is set in a world where everyone and everything is hooked together via the hypernet. Imagine the Internet of Things on steroids. The firewall ability represents the model's ability to resist being hacked. This leads us to the middle column. Some models have hacking capabilities due to their close association to the hypernet. This means they get digital hit points and a cyber capability. The cyber capability is the opposite of the firewall capability, and that is used when trying to hack instead of defending against a hack. The digital hit points is just a way to track how well connected the model is to the local hypernet. So if you take a model's digital hit points to 0, you don't remove it from the board and take it out of action, as you would in the case it lost all its physical hit points. That model just loses its ability to hack. This brings us to virtual beings that can only exist in the local hypernet. They have a much smaller stat line as they technically can't interact with any physical objects, but also can't be hurt by them or impeded by them. We'll talk more about this in a later video. One thing I should point out, because this kind of got me at first when reading the rules, virtual beings have 2 move stats. The first number, or move, shows how far they can float about the board per move action. The tether number shows the max distance they can be from some object on the board. The idea behind this is that if there's an angry piece of code defending a door on the board, it can't stray too far away from that door. This might sound complicated at first, but just think of it this way. Hacking is the same thing as casting spells. Certain models can cast spells or hack, while others can't. The firewall stat is basically a saving throw versus spells, and there's a magical parallel world, aka the internet or hypernet, that coexists with the real world, where magical beings in that world can cast spells at you. Whenever you do something, you use one of your stats and conduct a test. These tests are opposed tests or unopposed tests. You use opposed tests when 2 models are struggling with each other. This most commonly occurs in combat. The controlling player will throw a d10, add the appropriate stat, and any modifiers. The highest score at the end of the process wins. Ties go to the defender. So let's use a simple example of melee. This is just for explanatory purposes. We will go deeper into melee combat in a later video. Model A has a melee stat of 5, while Model B has a defense stat of 5. Since ties go to the defender, Model A will have to always roll 1 number higher than Model B. In an unopposed test, you're not rolling off against an opponent. Instead, you have to beat an arbitrary number called the target number, which is always 10 in the current version of the rules. I say current version because I could see this changing in some future expansion of the game. As the rules state, you always have to beat the target number of 10. This means that with your d10 roll and your ability modifiers added together, you need to always get an 11. The most common unopposed test you'll run into is your activation test, which we'll explain more in a later video when we go into the turn sequence. This test is based off your metal, which is in essence a catch-all capability. This brings us to certain dice rolls that deviate from the norms: criticals and fumbles. A critical can only be rolled on a d10 when you roll a natural 10. If you roll a 6 on a d6, you don't get a critical. It doesn't apply to a 6-sided dice, only a 10-sided dice. This is also the case in an opposed test, where you automatically win even if your opponent gets a higher score due to modifiers stacked on their dice roll. The only exception to this is if both attacker and defender rolls a 10 naturally. The rules state that both sides roll off again. This is the one case where the tie does not go to the defender. The opposite of the critical is the fumble. If you roll a 1 on a d10, you have fumbled. Modifiers do not mean anything here. Once again, rolls of a 1 on a d6 do not mean a fumble. It only applies to a d10. On an unopposed test, a roll of a 1 is an automatic failure. On an opposed test, a roll of a 1 is an automatic failure unless the other person rolls a fumble, which means that just as in the case of the critical, both sides must roll again. Now in some cases, you'll be asked to roll a d3. This is just a 6-sided die with the result divided by 3 and rounded up, so rolls of 1 and 2 equal 1 result, and so on. Now in the previous video, I discussed the fact that you might want to consider getting a scatter die if you're using grenades. The rulebook workaround to not having a scatter die is to use the d10 and take the point of the die as the direction of where whatever random effect rolls off to. Now that we have that out of the way, we can start talking about where the rubber meets the road. Now we'll discuss the turn sequence.